The legalization of cannabis in the United States has some similarities to the end of prohibition, but looking at the health effects between alcohol and cannabis reveals some differences that my guest on Truthout Interviews is here to discuss. Paul Armentano is the Deputy Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws and is the co-author of the book Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink? Paul also penned an op-ed piece for Truthout entitled Booze or Pot? No question which substance is more harmful to health. Hi, Paul. Welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Hello there. It's good to be here.
Alcohol, as you detail in your article, leads to the deterioration of the liver, can lead to violent behavior, can even exacerbate depression. Now, your piece for Truthout makes the argument that pot is much less harmful to one's health if we're looking at them as side-by-side comparisons as drugs. Now, alcohol is a depressant, but what is cannabis, and what does that mean that when you say it's less harmful?
When we're talking about harm, we can bring up whatever objective metric we wish to when we do a side-by-side comparison of alcohol versus cannabis. Whether we're looking at potential harm to the individual user, or we're looking at the burden of overall harm to a society, whether we're looking at objective yardsticks like toxicity, risk of overdose, lost productivity in the workplace, a degree of impairment, potential risk of dependence. On all of these metrics, cannabis shows itself objectively to be far less detrimental to both the individual and to society as a whole than alcohol. That's not to say cannabis is innocuous or without harm altogether or potential risks altogether, but it is a confirmation that alcohol is by far the more detrimental substance. The irony, of course, is that as a society, we celebrate alcohol while we criminalize and stigmatize the users of cannabis, arguably or objectively the safer of the two.
So when we look at cannabis, say, like you said, alcohol can be a depressant at times. They say if you're going through a stressful time, people often say this, boy, I just really need a drink. I had a hard day at work, or boy, that commute was horrible. I could sure use, a good stiff drink. But that can actually exacerbate your condition in a way. At one point, you probably feel a little bit relaxed, but then they say if you're actually depressed, it can make it even worse. But if we're looking at sort of that comparison, does cannabis have a similar or some kind of effect that's similar, whether it accelerates certain behavioral traits?
Sure. Well, from a pharmacological standpoint, ethanol is a central nervous system depressant. We can say that because alcohol or ethanol has an affinity for the opiate receptors, and they are based in the brain stem or the central nervous system, and they regulate our breathing and our consciousness. This is why a person could line up 21 shots on their 21st birthday, consume them all, lose consciousness, slip into a coma, and die, because they are consuming a substance that is acting on the part of the brain that regulates our consciousness, keeps us breathing, and keeps us alive. That's why we see potential risk of overdose associated with opiates, and we see that same potential risk of overdose in a dose-dependent manner associated with alcohol. Cannabis has therapeutic, physiological, and mood-altering qualities because there are unique constituents in the plant known as cannabinoids, and those cannabinoids interact or act upon a very specific receptor system that exists in the human body known as the endogenous cannabinoid regulatory system. While there are cannabis-specific receptors in the brain of human beings, we do not find a significant amount of those receptors in the brainstem. That is why cannabis is not a central nervous system depressant, and that's why it's incapable of causing lethal overdose.
Now, all drugs have side effects. With alcohol, and I've done this, where you just drank too much, the next morning you feel pretty lousy. You can lose sleep. Sometimes it's easy to get to sleep by consuming alcohol, but then you wake up very, like maybe in the middle of the night, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and it's almost like a sugar rush. Now, the joke is that the biggest side effect with cannabis is overeating because it tends to stimulate people. You get the munchies. Let's just put it out there right there. So, what other side effects are we looking at in terms of with regards to cannabis besides the fact that, well, if there's a 24-hour market open, that merchant stands to benefit economically from purchases of food.
Cannabis is not a single molecule plant. It's a plant that consists of a multitude of compounds, many of which, over 100 of which, are believed to be biologically active, which means depending on which compound we're talking about, there's either going to be a mood-altering effect, there's going to be a therapeutic effect, or there's going to be a physiological effect, like, say, an temporary increase in blood pressure. So it depends to some degree which compounds we're talking about and whether we're talking about potential beneficial effects or potential adverse effects. In the context of, again, sort of doing a side-by-side comparison with alcohol, if we were to talk about potential risks, as I said earlier, certainly cannabis is not necessarily innocuous. Cannabis can have pharmacological effects. It can temporarily elevate heart rate and blood pressure. As a result, some cannabis-naive users tend to report a tachycardia associated with use of cannabis, typically in a dose-dependent manner, so the greater quantity that's consumed or the greater potency of THC, which is the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis, may be associated with tachycardia, paranoia. Obviously, cannabis can affect judgment. It can impact psychomotor performance. Certainly, when we're talking about younger people and their brains are still developing, there are some concerns about use of cannabis within that population. There's also concerns about the use of cannabis when one is pregnant. So certainly, like with any mood-altering substance, some level of caution ought to be exhibited.
We have elections coming up in November, and a number of states are going to be deciding on medical marijuana laws. The end of your piece, as I read it, was really about the reclassification of cannabis from a Schedule I controlled substance to, I would guess, something that falls under the regulation of alcohol and tobacco. Do I have that roughly right?
So in 1970, Congress enacted the Controlled Substances Act. And what this act did was it placed selected controlled substances, or drugs, if you will, in one of 5 classifications. Class 1 being the most restrictive classification, Class 5 being the least restrictive classification.
Oh, I guess I got that wrong. It was Schedule 1 classification, right?
Yes. So by definition, a Schedule 1 substance, the most restrictive of this 5-class scheduling system, maintains that a controlled substance must possess a high potential for abuse, no accepted medicinal use in the United States, and its potential harms to the user must be so great that this drug could not even be administered in a controlled environment like a hospital. And for a drug to be placed in Category 1 or Schedule 1, it must meet all 3 definitions. Congress, in its infinite wisdom in 1970, placed the cannabis plant and its active constituents as a Schedule 1 substance, arguing that it does in fact meet all 3 criteria. Ironically, alcohol and tobacco are unscheduled. They're neither Schedule 1 nor Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5.
Well, based on that definition that you were talking about, I looked at, okay, you've got a lot of deleterious effects with alcohol, definitely with tobacco, but yet they don't even come close. Guess who was lobbying Congress back in the 70s to make it into a Schedule 1 narcotic?
Yes, it's very interesting. And when one looks at other controlled substances, we see that marijuana is classified alongside heroin, while controlled substances like methamphetamine, cocaine, anabolic steroids, these are drugs that actually fall into less restrictive categorizations under the present scheduling. I bring up the scheduling because, again, it provides a contrast to the way our public policy addresses marijuana versus the way it addresses alcohol, but also to sort of bring to light this inherent disconnect that exists between what the science says, what the general public believes, and what the public policy is. Because I would dare say that outside of the 535 members of Congress, you would be hard-pressed to find a majority of Americans anywhere else in this country that would affirm the science actually in 2014 is supportive of this Schedule I classification for marijuana. It is an absurd classification, made even more absurd when one factors in the reality that tobacco and alcohol are not even classified at all under the law. And that's a public policy that needs to change, and change immediately.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the time in which this law was passed. You said it was 1970?
Yes.
So you had the countercultural movement sort of plateauing at that point. A lot of pot use was among the young people. There was a lot of fear among the adult population that there was sort of these crazed pothead youth that were going to overrun society, or look at it as kind of a generational thing, that it was a reaction to the countercultural use of drugs, but wanting to preserve the drugs that the former generation deemed okay, which was alcohol and tobacco. So you had the parents regulating what the kids were using.
Yes, and clearly, America loves its alcohol. I mean, alcohol is ubiquitous in American society. It's even part of the lexicon. If I use the phrase happy hour, and your audience knows exactly what I'm referring to. We are referring to a time generally that occurs after people get off work, when bars discount the sale of alcohol. The term Joe's Six-Pack, this idea that it is a colloquial term of affection. It refers to the average working person in America. When taken quite literally, it refers to someone who would come home and drink a quantity of 6 or more alcoholic beverages. That would otherwise be defined as an alcoholic. But the branding and the marketing and the ubiquity of alcohol over the years has really influenced our visceral response to alcohol. And I would argue that branding works. And unfortunately for cannabis, for many decades, the only public paid marketing campaign that existed surrounding cannabis was a campaign largely funded and promoted by the federal government to demonize it.
Well, Paul, I really want to thank you for being on the program. You have very articulate. You're very articulate, and you really laid out some of the side-by-side comparisons of the health effects. Talked very well about, well spoken about the laws and the way in which popular culture embraces one type of drug and sort of eschews the other. So thanks again for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you for having me. And if folks want to learn more about this issue, I encourage them to check out the NORML website and the NORML blog. They're both available online at www.norml.org. And they also may want to consider checking out the book Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink, which is available on Amazon and from most brick and mortar booksellers.
All right. Paul Armentano, you also was the author of the piece on Truthout called Booze or Pot? No question which substance is more harmful to health. And thanks again for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.